Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Washington, D.C. policy briefing by Sasakawa USA. We will be having the state of the Indo-Pacific region and the U.S. Japan Alliance, featuring Admiral Philip Davidson, who is the 25th Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. My name is Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. As many of you may know, Sasakawa USA is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization dedicated to deepening the understanding of and strengthening the relationship between the U.S. and Japan for the benefit of a free and open international community. Our activities mainly focus on security and diplomacy through the engagement of exchanges, dialogue, analysis, publication, and networking. Today's event is being recorded and is on the record. A recap and video recording will be made available on Sasakawa USA's website in the coming weeks. There will be time for Q&A later in the program. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to submit those questions at any time throughout the discussion. I will now turn it over to Dr. Satohiro Akimoto, Chairman and President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. どうぞよろしくお願いします。
はい、どうもありがとうございます。Thank you, Shanti. I am delighted to see you all. Thank you very much for attending. I am honored to have Admiral Philip Davidson to our policy briefing today, particularly when we are witnessing tragic destructions and horrific atrocities unfolding in Ukraine. The world seems to be entering a new, unstable, and dangerous stage in the post-Cold War era, where what we thought as our universal values and norms, such as democracy, freedom, rule of law, free enterprise, and transparency, are seriously challenged. After all, what unfolding in Ukraine is a powerful reminder that there are major countries which are mostly dominated by a strong single leadership, which disrespect and disregard basic values and norms in the international community. Paternalistic relationship exists between the political leadership and the business leadership, only to maximize and cater to their own interest at all costs. There's even willingness to threaten and use deadly force to neighbors, supported by uninformed nationalism and patriotism of their own people. I am grateful for Admiral Davidson to share his thought to make sense of what's happening in Europe today, think about implication to Indo-Pacific, and discuss what the United States and Japan can do to contribute to the better world. Admiral Philip Davidson is 25th Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. The largest combatant command consists of nearly 380,000 personnel and held the responsibility for all U.S. military activities across the Indo-Pacific, the region which is central to the future of U.S.-Japan relationship from 2018 to 2021. He had nearly 39 years of active service, which covers a wide geographical areas and functional responsibilities. He was awarded the Grand Cordon of Order of Rising Sun Medal by the Japanese government in April 2021. We are honored to have him as a member of our advisory board at Sasakawa USA. With that, Admiral Davidson, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Satohiro. I appreciate your introduction and your very important comments on the state of things across the globe at the current time. It's wonderful to see so many friends from both the USA and Japan tune in from around the world. Hopefully we can do these kind of things in person internationally sooner rather than later. I'd like to make a couple of special acknowledgements first. I'd like to acknowledge Minister Ishigaki for his attendance here as well. We look forward to seeing you in the United States. And I would also like to congratulate retired Lieutenant Generals Chip Gregson and Larry Nicholson of the United States Marine Corps for their new appointments as distinguished senior fellows to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. It is great to see you both. And again, I hope we can connect in person here soon. I'd like to acknowledge also the very good work of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, its gracious patron, Yohei Sasakawa, of course, and its chairman, Satohiro Akimoto, who spoke with us a moment ago. I'm proud to be associated with an organization so dedicated to the advancement of U.S. Japan relations. I intend to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll all agree. I'd like to turn it into more of a discussion as opposed to Q&A, but I'd be happy to take your questions as well. I've said it over and over again. There is no more important alliance to the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific than the U.S. Japan Alliance. For all of you working to deepen that alliance, I thank you. It is the most important alliance work in the Indo-Pacific. Why? Well, we are seeing in real time, as we say, what authoritarian powers are truly capable of in the 21st century. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine on February 24th is proof of that. Until the 24th, and for some years now, many have spoken of a multipolar world and a new era of global competition, or great power competition, if you like. And many of them wondered what the purpose of this competition was or could be. And disturbingly, some even welcomed the possibility of change to the international world order that we've known. Others noted the changes in relative national power around the world, in combat, in economic power, in population, in diplomatic reach, in access to resources, and changes to political alignments, and called it the decline of the West. At best, some hoped that a rising global economy and a modicum of competition would bring tension between states only on the margins, that liberal values would be lifted and expanded automatically with the rising economic tide. And at worst, well, we can see what that world looks like now. The attempted deliberate destruction of a sovereign state, the disruption of the global economy, and sickeningly, the severe and indiscriminate loss of life. This is the real world. In the United States, there will be some who will argue that this is not a threat to the homeland or Americans abroad, so not to worry for now. In Japan, and perhaps elsewhere, perhaps Ukraine seems even farther away, but those arguments are wrong. The preservation of the international order is absolutely in our American interest, and I would submit in Japan's and in our alliance interest as well. Thomas Paine said, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." That cause isn't nebulous. That cause is inalienable, as our founders outlined in the United States. And you know them simply as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the last few years, through 2 US administrations now, the United States, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, India, and some others have converged around the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Unsaid, but in there nevertheless, is the cause of all mankind, as Thomas Paine would say. How? Well, what do we mean when we say free and open? When we say free, I mean free, both in terms of traditional security, free from even coercion, and in terms of values and political systems, with respect to individual rights and liberties, and in the promotion of good governance. Values our 2 countries share, values that Thomas Paine would recognize. Free also means nations do not have to choose who they partner or trade with out of fear or coercion. Instead, they are free to exercise their sovereignty, their choice. When we say open, I mean open. All nations should enjoy unfettered, open access to the seas and airways upon which our economies and our people depend. And according to this vision, nations would be able to have open investment environments, transparent agreements between one another, the protection of intellectual property and property rights, and fair and reciprocal trade. Simple. Well, the idea is simple. Delivering on a free and open Indo-Pacific is the hard part. We must attract other nations to this vision. We must put together the ways and means to uphold, ensure, and indeed enforce this vision using all elements of our national power and our allied power, diplomatically, economically, and yes, militarily. We must be willing to risk that when others oppose this vision, we will rise to the challenge. Again, using all elements of our respective national and allied powers, diplomatically, economically, and yes, militarily, free and open. Why? My comments on Russia that began this discussion are pertinent. We know what closed and authoritarian can do and will do. In Russia, we know now the strategic signs were all there. Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, their annexation of Crimea in 2014, the war in the Donbass and in Syria over the course of nearly a decade now. Putin's long-term effort to try and insulate Russia from economic sanctions, to create leverage with energy resources and transport, among other efforts, and Putin's long-term effort to parlay the false narrative on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine. He told us what he intended to do. And now this, it's real. As I said, Russia's invasion of another sovereign state, thousands of Ukrainians dead, more than 3.5 million Ukrainian refugees cast across Europe and the Caucasus. These are lives and liberties lost, the cause of all mankind, the cause of America, as Thomas Paine told us. It may be true that the inability to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine was a deterrence failure. Perhaps the free world did not mean to deter him, or perhaps he simply could not be deterred. There is more to know and learn here. It is clear Putin had two objectives. First, destroy Ukraine, a democratic state on Russia's border. And second, to shatter the NATO alliance. For now, Putin has failed in the second. NATO has been unified and galvanized. But we are a long way from knowing whether the measures taken now will cause Putin to fail with the first. We do know this already. Ukraine is in ruins. I will say it again. Ukraine is in ruins. Now, in the People's Republic of China, what does Chairman Xi make of this? That is a good question. In China, the strategic signs are also there. The militarization of artificial features in the South China Sea, the incursions in the Senkaku Islands, the enslavement of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, increased air and maritime activities near Taiwan and Japan, and the U.S. territories of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. There is more to China's strategic signaling. Their staggering growth in air and maritime forces and their rocket, cyber, and space capabilities. The economic coercion of Korea, Australia, Canada, and others. The long-term effort to insulate China by stockpiling energy and rare earth or strategic minerals. To create leverage with their Belt and Road Initiative and their wolf warrior diplomacy. And as well there, to parlay the false narrative of historic claims to the South China Sea, to Taiwan and elsewhere. Oh, and Chairman Xi has told us what he will do as well, saying unification with Taiwan is the great trend of history, and by specifically noting that the use of force is an option. And now, I'm sure he's taking a lesson or three from Putin's invasion and the world's response. Most importantly, what do we make of this? What should we make of this? I know this, a failure of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the East China Sea or South China Sea would be an even bigger disaster. If you think the economy is bad when we remove Russia's mere 8% of US imported oil and gas, what do we think the global economy will look like when 92% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors come from Taiwan? How about the fact that China already controls 55% of the world's rare earth mining and 85% of its refining? How about when the world's first, second, China, and third, Japan, largest economies in the world, are all immediately affected? What happens then? The Russian stock market was closed for a month before partially reopening. What stock markets might close, and for how long, because of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait? The Taiwan Stock Exchange, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore, New York, Apple, Disney, Goldman Sachs, Exxon, GM, and other US companies are pulling business or more in Russia. What business impacts occur in a Taiwan Strait or East or South China Sea conflict? In China, Taiwan, Japan, the United States. And who would embargo whom between the global economy's absolute largest players? I know it will be too late until Taiwan is ruined. It will be too late to wait until the global economy is ruined. It is absolutely in our interest to prevent outcomes like this, even as far away as Ukraine and Taiwan. For the United States, and again, I would submit for Japan and for the world, there is much to be done economically, diplomatically, and so on in the region, indeed the world, to prevent this from happening. We must deter such adventurism by China, by Russia, and by any other that would destroy the world's interests for the sake of their own. So, for the U.S. Japan Alliance, what do we need to do? First, especially in America, we must understand the important changes happening around the globe and in Asia. Before this decade is over, 2/3 of the world's population and 2/3 of the global economy will be centered on Asia. 7 of the world's 10 largest militaries, and that includes us, are located in the Indo-Pacific now. 4 of the 5 largest economies in the world by the end of the decade. There are important international issues moving from the back burner to the front when it comes to our long-term security and economic interests, and the rising power of China and their willingness to coerce, corrupt, and co-opt others in the region is meant to undermine the security landscape in a way that convinces all others, including the United States, Japan, that the cost of denying the PRC's ambitions are too high to oppose. We must recognize the long-term interests critical to our two nations in space policy, cyberspace policy, cryptocurrency and reserve currency policy, trade, telecommunications and network security, energy security and climate security, the freedom of the seas and skies. All of these are at stake right now. If we don't engage, China will, and they will determine the outcomes for, again, 2/3 of the world's population and 2/3 of the global economy by the end of the decade. And with Chairman Xi, whether internally, like in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or externally, like along the line of actual control with India or potentially with Taiwan, there was always the use of force option in the background. That brings me to the second. We must deepen our military alliance. I am quite proud of the improvements in transparency, collaboration, and cooperation our two nations made during my time as Commander U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. But there is so much to do within our military alliance still. We need to improve our combined lethality. This means more and more capable long-range offensive fires capable of striking stationary and moving targets. These fires must come from sea air, land, space, and cyberspace. And we need the platforms to go with them. That's ships, submarines, longer range aircraft, and yes, ground-based firing platforms as well. We also have to commit to improving our operational design and posture. What does that mean? Well, we have to take note of the geography, the new geography in space and cyberspace, the vast sea and air domains, and our combined fixed bases and infrastructure. We have to harden and defend, find and develop expeditionary sites and joint concepts, and create the virtues of mass without the vulnerabilities of concentration where we can. And we have to do this in the first island chain, the second island chain, and yes, even as far as the third island chain, which includes Hawaii. We must also continue to improve our cooperation and continue to experiment more deeply with our allied command and control to deliver a joint and allied force that can win. This means improved and integrated planning for our combined operations so we can mutually understand what it takes to win. It also means even more transparency in our allied exercises and our operations on a day-to-day basis. And we must be willing to experiment more deeply with an allied command and control mechanism. Let's find out what we can do together day to day in our operations to manage the risks from the PRC and deter their adventurism in the day-to-day, the gray zone, the hybrid era, as you would think about it, but also to prevent and deter conflict in the East China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. We also need to combine our efforts to strengthen our allies and partners with intelligence and information sharing, more interoperability with our combined technology, and better access in the region. There is much more we can do in information, allied and partner networks, and intelligence sharing in the near term between our two nations and with others to help deter and prevent war now. I should add, this includes consistent and robust arms sales to Taiwan. We have to help them deter day after day, not deliver tools to be used only when the enemy has already attacked their networks, bases, and beaches. Ukrainian forces are doing well in combat, but the point is to prevent combat from even happening. Lastly, we must remember our two nations, the world's largest economy and third largest economy by GDP, have the weight, the standing, and the influence with others to deter Chairman Xi and the Communist Party of China's already stated intention to subjugate its neighbors in the region, disrupt the international world order, and replace it with one with Chinese characteristics. We know from the real world that it is in our interest to prevent this from happening. We must deter such adventurism by China, by Russia, and by any other that would destroy the world's interests for the sake of their own. It only takes the will. The rest of the world is counting on us. Think about what they make of all this. Not Putin, not Xi, not the United States, not Japan, the rest of the world, countries like Ukraine and Taiwan. Is their cause worthy of us? Is it in our interest? If not, do they abandon the international order and submit to arbitrary and despotic rule? In that case, do you think they will be free to exchange with us, trade with us, share their innovations or ideas with us? How about us with them? Does our prosperity and our security depend upon these exchanges? I'll tell you what I think the rest of the world is pondering. They're really wondering, are we worthy of them? NATO has been galvanized by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let it galvanize our will to deter China from any military or coercive adventurism as well. I know it is hard work. Better to do that work now while we can think and act to prevent war. I submit it is in our respective nations' interests, and indeed, the cause of all mankind depends upon it. So thank you for your time and attention today. I appreciate it. I look forward to the discussion here that ensues. And once again, it's great to see everyone, even if only virtually. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Admiral Davidson, for your clear analysis and very strong and important message with conviction. And you paved the way for meaningful discussion to follow. So thank you very much. I would like to just mention one point, which you mentioned, that the importance of galvanizing the international community will. And from the viewpoint of Japan, I would like to point out that both Japanese government and Japanese people seems to take this issue seriously with the urgency that you pointed out as important. On the Japanese government front, Prime Minister Kishida's administration clearly changed Japan's policy toward Russia and enters into a new phase with regard to Japan's relationship with Russia. On the front of Japanese people, in the latest Nikkei poll, 77% of Japanese people say responded that what happening in Europe could spill over to Taiwan in the Pacific. I'm not just try to be alarmist or anything, but just wanted to point it out as people taking it seriously. And also 90% of Japanese people in the same Nikkei poll said that they support Japanese government effort to accept Ukrainian people who fled the country. So it's contrary to stereotyped image of what Japan can do or cannot do with regard to people fleeing atrocities. And I see a change. My understanding is that Japan has already accepted over 400 Ukrainians who fled the country. So let me just stop in saying that both Japanese government and Japanese people seems to take this issue very seriously in conjunction with their security environment. So with that, I'd like to kick off our discussion and Q&A. And I'd like to invite Ms. Emma Shanlett Avery of Congressional Research Service to kick off the session. Emma, great to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you, and thank you, Satohiro-san. Admiral Davidson, thanks so much for your comments. And I wanted to ask about our allies and particularly Japan's reaction to Chinese nuclear modernization, and if that is distinct from its conventional capabilities. I would assume that some Japanese leaders would be concerned that it would weaken U.S. resolve as Chinese capabilities grow in that area. Do you think that it has fueled debate, even if at the margins, about Japan acquiring its own nuclear capability? And what are the kind of things that we can do to reassure Japan and other allies in the Indo-Pacific as China develops its capability? Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. A year ago, we spent quite a bit of time in my last Senate testimony about the trends in nuclear capability changes in China, particularly the staggering growth that we've experienced or observed, I should say, over the last 20 years, and what I expect to happen in the next 5 to 10 as well. And it wasn't meant to be controversial. Senator Cotton and I exchanged some terms interchangeably using stockpile when we were talking about actual delivery platforms at one point that confused the discussion, which is I corrected for the record following. But the fact of the matter is, in delivery platforms, we expect China's nuclear capability in delivery platforms to quadruple over the course of the next decade. That would then exceed America's deployed delivery platforms. That's ICBMs, that's SSBNs, that's bomber capabilities. with the associated missiles. And that's of great concern to U.S. nuclear policy. And indeed, as you, or as I infer from your comments, the Japan-U.S. policy as well. The extended deterrent is a critical component of our alliance, a critical component of the assurance that Japan has enjoyed over the nuclear era, and is critical to, I think, the way ahead, and should certainly inform the development and changes that we have in our policy. I'm not sure I'm going to capture the nuance of your question, but I inferred from your comment, can you separate nuclear policy from conventional policies here? I think as we're observing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we cannot. Russia's stated and exercised nuclear changes, raising alerts, things like that. The test of 48 hours ago are, meant to signal that they're combining that nuclear capability with, the conventional approach they have to the Ukraine forward. And what I mean is they're trying to influence the international order's support to Ukraine through both their nuclear and conventional policy. It's going to be linked going forward. And we have to acknowledge that when we think about the U.S. nuclear posture and our capability set going forward, and the extended deterrent that we provide to Japan.
Next question comes from Mark Ersty from Representative Steve Chabot office, House Foreign Affairs Asia Pacific Committee. Does Admiral Davidson still believe that the timeline he predicted for possible Taiwan conflict, and what impact, if any, is the war in Ukraine having on the timeline?
Thank you very much for your question. Very smart, and it's something I'm thinking about every day. So at this time, I still believe this decade of the 20s is the decade of concern. And I am particularly concerned about now, the next 5 years, the time between now and 2027, and the potential election of Xi Jinping to a fourth possible term. There are many demographic challenges in China to come in the 30s and 40s. And that, combined with the changes that I highlighted in my comments, dramatic military growth in really all domains and all forces, and they're very coercive activities that are going on today, along with the political cycle in China, are the things that drive me to that timeline. I certainly believe that Xi Jinping is thinking about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, may affect the timeline, but it doesn't change my opinion that this is the decade of concern, and we have to be particularly worried about the next 5 years. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mr. Kanehara to come on screen and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Admiral. I just to follow up the question of Emma, suddenly the nuclear blackmailing by Xi Jinping, like in Putin way, becomes real for the many Japanese in Taiwan contingency. This is very reckless blackmailing by Putin, using the small-scale nuclear weapons, threatening the non-nuclear members of the international community. When U.S. starts to help Taiwanese in the Taiwan contingency, Japan will help the United States. That is the change of the law made by Prime Minister Abe. Japan can now fight together with the United States to help Taiwanese under new law made by Prime Minister Abe. If the Xi Jinping says, don't help Americans, if you do that, the China might use the small scale weapons to say destroy a small Japanese island basis of self-defense forces, and that will continue. Number one, number two, number three explosions. So don't do that. Are we ready to cope with this kind of reckless blackmailing by Xi Jinping in the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is the great conundrum of nuclear policy and deterrent policy over the last 70 years. And the principles that support all that are still true today. And, you know, we have to, in the United States, in my opinion, you know, continue the extended deterrent and the nuclear policy that has supported the international order over the last 70 years. That kind of nuclear blackmail is unacceptable. And it also points to the reasons that we have to engage now, diplomatically, economically, militarily, to convince others, closed and authoritarian states especially, that we will not be blackmailed by such pronouncements and threats.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, all of us know that Mr. Kanehara was Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary under Abe administration and currently a professor at Doshisha University. Next, I would like to invite Rexon Ryu, Asia Group. Rexon.
Nice to see you. Thank you for this event. And Admiral Davidson, thank you for your very comprehensive comments. I'd like to pick up on two aspects of the sort of prescriptive recommendations you offered, one related to Japan and one on Taiwan. On Japan, my question to you is the evolution into longer range fires, into more integrated command and control, command structures, planning, combined forces. Where do you see the challenges in moving forward in those respects? Are the challenges more on the US side, on the Japanese side? How do you see the hurdles to achieving some of these near-term objectives? Because I think I sense a lot of support for each of these. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. And then second, and probably more important, on Taiwan, I really heard you emphasize deterrence and the risk of the failure to deter. And that to your point, once if we're in a Taiwan scenario where the fight has moved to the shores of Taiwan, I think you may have used, or maybe they're my words, that's too late. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on what that means for the priorities of where the United States should be helping Taiwan. You highlighted the need for the greater capability in the day-to-day, the gray zone, the hybrid challenges that Taiwan faces, not just in the stages of conflict. There's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. focused on, however, the conflict on Taiwan, you know, the allusion to making Taiwan a porcupine, or the focus on, you know, civil defense capabilities. And I think that misses a lot of the challenge. And I heard you implicitly saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to sort of try to draw you out a little bit, because I think this is a critical debate that in some ways is getting swept under a little bit, because everyone wants to say they support asymmetric. And I think that there's more to ensuring Taiwan has the right capabilities in our interest, in Japan's interest, than just a sort of prescriptive question of whether any particular capability is asymmetric. Yeah. So sorry to go on for so long, but no,
I appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
No, thanks for your questions, Rexon. You probably haven't seen me speak too often because I'm terrible at two questions. I always forget.
No, I know, and I'm guilty of
I'll come back to it. You know, to the point of the first, our two nations have an alliance obligation to plan some scenarios together, and I was very pleased in the planning efforts during my time as the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command commander with both Admiral Kawano and General Yamazaki for East China Sea crises. There was more transparency, more robust planning, more partnership in that time frame. So I was very pleased with that. we also experimented a little bit with some of the incursions is too strong a word. Some of the activities, co-bomber flights with Russia, Chinese, in the Sea of Japan, in the Philippine Sea and things like that, to hand off escort responsibilities from fighter to fighter kind of thing between our two nations. That's an operational integration that I think we should deepen. And this is going to be related to your second question a little bit. We can't forget that, China, first is trying to deter us with their activities. So their signaling and their military activities at scale, and the changes in the capacity that China is starting to put in the battle space as we speak in military parlance, is meant to wear down our conventional capabilities. Sharing some of those responsibilities between the U.S. Japan, I think would be important, and more transparency in the day-to-day is I think also important. I think we should be experimenting with, an allied command and control structure. Doesn't have to be permanent. Let's experiment with it, see what we learn, see what the barriers are as you described, and then talk to the political leadership about what those barriers are and whether we want to work through some of that. Fires is a challenge. I mean, I know what it means to the Japanese government, but we cannot let an arbitrary thing like range, prevent us from the defenses that we need in order to deter and defend over time. But you can't play football or soccer in the American parlance without trying to win. And to win, you can't just play defense. You've got to be able to score a goal. So the forces and the ports of departure and airports of departure, and those kind of things have to be at risk. And I know this is a challenge to Japan. It needs to be thought through now. We can't continue to, I would submit respectfully, that Japan doesn't have much longer to kick this can down the road without considering it soon. That said, there's more to fires than just the weapons, right? There's the sensing, there's the intelligence and information sharing, there's the command and control that networks it all. Those are areas in which we can share in the very near term to help facilitate these things going forward. So I'll leave that at I'll leave it at that on part one. On part two, to your point about deterrence, yes, Taiwan does need some asymmetric capabilities. There's no doubt. But again, I'll restate it. It takes more than that to deter. China's choice when it comes to Taiwan would be to coerce them in the gray zone, as some say it, what I call the day-to-day, to get Taiwan to submit, to wear down their conventional forces. Those conventional forces have to be there to defend and deter. F-16s need to be provided for. Missile defenses need to be provided for. They need ships and submarines as well. They are going to need, conventional force capability in order to deter. That includes fires and sensing and things like that as well. I was very frustrated when I was the Indo-PACOM commander that it took quite a bit of time, measured in years and months, because there was arguments back in Washington about whether they should be buying 66 coastal defense cruise missiles or 100. I mean, come on, let's move on the discussion and keep going forward. We need consistency. We need to recognize that they need both conventional and asymmetric capabilities in their portfolio. And we need to recognize that they have a high readiness component in Taiwan. And we cannot risk the erosion of their conventional capability in ships and aircraft and things like that takes to deter in a day-to-day environment because of the high rate of use that they're going through. Those are going to have to be replaced as well. Thanks for your question, Rex.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Minister Ishigaki of Japanese Embassy. How do you see U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of trade and investment now that China has submitted its application to join CPTPP? Recent challenges of supply chain, rare earth minerals, food, energy security highlight the critical importance of rule-based global trade. What is your thought on the U.S. role in the strategic point of view?
Thank you, Minister, for your question very much. I have to say what I've always said. I'm the worst trade minister in the United States, and so my comments should be cast in that. The TPP was walked away from by the United States in 2016 by both political parties, making future participation in this very difficult for the United States. I would submit in my own conversations with political leadership in both parties on Capitol Hill, especially, many of the geopolitical and strategic concerns of the Asia Pacific were not, part of that calculus. It was solely a domestic calculus that came to that outcome. I personally would agree that the United States needs to join the CPTPP. I would make that recommendation if asked from the geopolitical and strategic view, but I am severely hamstrung by the domestic politics and my own independence of that during my time as the Indo-Pacific Command commander to be able to predict for you how that might come about. That would be an extremely heavy political lift for either party in the United States to deliver on, which makes this a very, very difficult challenge. That does not take away the import of trade and within the region and the United States' important role there, and our participation, if we cannot come to the CPTPP, to go all in on alternatives, whether it's multiple bilateral agreements to pursue this. But I agree with, I think the premise of your question is that our national security in large part is dependent on our trade security and energy security and things like that. And that's all a component here. It needs to be reconsidered in the United States. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I would like to take up a question from Yoshinari Kurose, who's from Sankei newspaper. What is your view on so-called nuclear sharing? Is deploying US nuclear weapons in Japan, incorporating into Japanese self-defense force operation, is a viable option to deter Chinese nuclear challenge?
No, I think that's a discussion to be had between our two governments and to be considered. I think it would be, we're just days, really, weeks into the Russia-Ukraine conflict here, and there's much more to learn about, and I implied it in my comments here, about the deterrent approaches of Russia, of Ukraine, of the international order, NATO, in this case going forward. I don't want to get out in front of the learning that needs to happen now, and the important discussions between our two governments that I think need to ensue. We have a history of extended deterrence, and the assurance that is provided there. As a strategist, I think as any strategist would support, anything that goes on in the world, that might change that strategy needs to be considered. And as we see this play out, we should, I think, have the transparency and approach in our alliance that we can discuss these things fairly and in a government-to-government fashion, and be informed by the important academics and former diplomats and military folks that will be thinking through this problem as well over the weeks to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Mr. Jim Schoff, who's a senior director at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, He is leading a program called U.S Japan Next Initiative, Next Alliance Initiative. Jim?
Thank you, Satohiro, and thank you so much, Admiral, for your remarks today.
Hello, Jim.
At this important time. And the timing, reading the paper this morning about the Solomon Islands announcement of the agreement with China seems to me very connected to a lot of the issues that you were talking about. So I wanted to ask, based on your experience in the region, how do you evaluate China's recent security agreement with the Solomon Islands? What do you think its significance might be? Are there other islands and countries that could follow suit? Did we fail in diplomacy with the Solomon Islands, or maybe this is a unique case of a leader cutting his own deal for his own purposes? So appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the gravest of
Sorry.
concerns.
May
I think
may
for
I
the internet.
just a second?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's also, I'm sorry, Admiral Davidson. There's also
that's quite all
sort of piggyback kind of questions from George Cunningham that whether AUKUS is an option to deal effectively with Chinese bases in Pacific Islands. I'm very sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right, Satohiro. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I view it with the gravest of concerns. I mean, these things really don't happen overnight. They happen over time. I made brief mention of China's approach to the region as coercive, corrupting, and co-opting. And there is a high level of coercion and corruption of political and business elites within the Pacific Island chain, which I think is of great concern. There is some U.S. law and some international law that helps deal with corruption, the GLOMAC law in the United States, but I think people are sometimes savvy to what those violations are and are working to avoid them. I don't know all the facts. I don't think the general public knows all the facts of what's transpired here between China and the Solomon Islands, but I do believe it is the gravest of security concerns. I do believe that the international community, those that have come together on a free and open Indo-Pacific, and we've had very transparent discussions between Australia, Japan, the UK, the United States, and France in this regard when it comes to the Pacific Island chain. We have to come together on developmental needs, economic needs, specific approaches that preserve the freedoms within the Pacific Island chain and prevent the kind of threat that Solomon's Islands bases presents to this third island chain and presents to Australia and presents to those that are believing in a free and open Indo-Pacific's approach to the Pacific Island chain. It's the gravest of concerns. And many of these nations are quite small, in the tens of thousands or smaller in the Pacific Island chain. Their geostrategic import is outsized from their population. And that's going to take continued convincing in the United States. And I think, with the others that believe in the free and open Indo-Pacific as well. But I think there's important opportunity here for the U.S., Japan, Australia, UK, New Zealand in this regard as well, and France to come together and work on these things diplomatically and economically to prevent outcomes like this. To the point about AUKUS, could this be a mechanism in which to help? Yeah, I mean, there's a very transparent dialogue between Australia and the United States in this regard when it comes to South Pacific security, when it comes to the North Pacific security, as the Australians think about Micronesia. And it could be a mechanism, but I think there is sufficient diplomatic and economic mechanisms to deepen that dialogue there. Thanks for your question, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a layperson's question with regard to military operation. Most people in the United States and in Japan have never been on the battlefield and probably will never be on the battlefield. Having said that, what's transpiring in Ukraine seems to be different from most experts predicted before conflict began, that Russians will quickly dominate at least the eastern side of Ukraine. They may not have enough resources to occupy and manage the entire Ukraine, which is a big country. But Kyiv seems to be overtaken by Russians in a matter of weeks. But we see now a situation is very different. And, Moscow was synced in the Black Sea. Ukraine, I think they prepared well after Crimea, but they've been fighting a fierce battle. Are there any lessons to be learned from what transpiring in terms of battlefields to Northeast Asia that both expert and a layman can understand?
Yeah, that's very profound, Satohiro. I can't speak as elegantly or eloquently as many of the philosophers and political leaders have over the spirit of free peoples. But I think you're seeing that play out in the Ukraine, right? The spirit of free peoples are finding the resiliency necessary to defend. I think that's probably the most important thing that we should take away whenever we're thinking about conflicts around the world. That said, there are, to your point, what this looks like to the layman around the rest of the world. One, I think it raises the importance of civil defense. And, when I think about Northeast Asia, things like missile defense, becomes critically important. Cyber defenses. I have no insight into what kind of battle is going on in cyberspace other than what we've read in the paper. But I would guess that the defenses of networks and things like that are, it's highly interactive cyber fights going on right now. Having that going forward, I think, would be critically important. Information warfare. Wow. What we're seeing play out in Russia, in China, on the ground in Ukraine, and the free world, I think critically important. And it's not just manipulation of formal media by any means. It's the obscene things that are happening in social media as well. That's something to be considered going forward. The sinking of the Moskva, the world hasn't really seen a profound sea battle in 40 years now, going back to the Falklands War. And the Moskva is the most significant sinking of a warship since the Belgrano 40 years ago. We don't have battlefields we can visit at sea, right? The sea sweeps it all away. And so I think it's hard for many to relate to how savage war at sea really is. And again, it takes high technology, it takes a high amount of readiness, and it takes high spirit in order to defend and fight at sea as well. So something to be considered there. I think there's more to learn. When we talk about energy defense, transportation, things like that, things that we see small disruptions. I just went through no power for 48 hours up in New York State. Imagine what that's like going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It would be a real challenge in coordination and collaboration, information and feeding your population and all those things. These are things that I think need to be readdressed as we come out of the 90s, the 00s and the 10s here, and we think about what conventional war or worse how it might play out between sovereign nations during the course of this decade and the next. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to take up a question from Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe, who's a researcher at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. If I may, just a little bit. Mr. Jim Schoff and I were in Tokyo 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, and a lot of people talking about increase of defense budget. And I think it's a context of and also acquiring a new weaponry. And I think that's the context of Mr. Watanabe's question. Thank you very much for your clear view on the bilateral alliance. Japanese government is now considering acquiring a strike capability, such as land-based mid-range missiles. How would this type of capability would affect the bilateral alliance and deterrence capability?
I think it would be profound. It'd be the most important change that I think could happen next. I would say the thing I'd like to see come alongside it a little bit is more experimentation with Allied command and control to make that happen. But more transparency, more collaboration when it comes to East China Sea and Taiwan Strait scenarios between our two nations, supplemented, and I already believe that Japan has extraordinary capability at sea, in the air, on the ground. Technology-wise, I've observed it. Readiness-wise, I've observed it. And spirit-wise, I've observed it. And bringing medium-range, longer-range missiles over time would be a profound change, and I think would deepen our ability to collaborate, cooperate, and share information as we think about these challenges in Northeast Asia.
Thank you very much. You may want to punt, but since you mentioned maritime self-defense force, Japanese self-defense forces have never been in a big combat situation after World War II. And you talk about the readiness, spirit, technology, so on and so forth. You used football or soccer analogy earlier. So if I may use the analogy, even if you are a starting quarterback, you got injured and you're on the sideline for a year, maybe 2 years, and coming back on the field is a challenge. So again, I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable, but and you don't have to answer. But what does this mean that military has not been in the combat situation for a long time?
Yeah, no, I mean it's certainly an issue that we talk about in the United States as well. Certainly a topic of conversation as we think about the long period of time, 15, 17 years that we spent doing counterinsurgency and constabulary responsibilities in Southwest Asia. Really for all our forces during that time frame. It's one of the reasons I think you really have to take a long view when it comes to allied exercises, but you have to have the funds kind of set aside to be able to make urgent changes. And, the way that we're seeing the globe play out now, I think would invite, more live firing opportunities, deeper exercise. We have this really exceptional keen series of exercise, keen edge, keen sword, and other things. Deepen those exercises, change the scenarios urgently, have the funds set aside in order to make more urgent changes, and to be able to follow through on those things. One, when I speak to a military audience, purely military audience, I also believe that we should be improving our training ranges. We operate on each other's training ranges at sea and in the air especially, but on the ground as well. And with AI coming and big data resources, I think we ought to be doing more and more gaming, and there ought to be an allied component to our war gaming as well as we think about these going forward. That would all help. I also believe that our more day-to-day deterrent activities in the air, at sea, on the ground, I think would raise the spirit and transparency between our tactical forces, which I think would be very, very important as well.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Mr. Shin Takahashi, Chairman of NEC America. What do we need to do to keep India as an ally for democracy against authoritarian nations, including Russia?
Yeah, India's a challenge here. I mean, they have signed on to free and open Indo-Pacific, but I think what we've seen in the last several weeks of their steadfast adherence to their strategic autonomy, that their contribution there probably has some caveats that maybe we're not aware of yet. But I've said it over and over again in the last few years, we're on a long journey with India. It dates back to the 1940s. And I say, and I don't mean this kiddingly, but we're on a 10,000 step journey with India. I think the United States is, I think the international community is. And in the United States, we're on like step 9. And there's no jumping ahead to step 5,000 and something. We have to work through 10 and 11 and things like that. So it's going to take, deep diplomatic conversation. I think we have to deepen the political interaction between leaders of our 3 countries in this case. And, continue to approach India economically, diplomatically, militarily, through the Quad and other functions, although it looks like militarily that's not going to be the core of the Quad, to deepen our relationship here going forward. We got a long way to go. We just have to work it. Who doesn't? I mean, they're going to be in the top 5 economically, if not already, and I'm sorry to be thin on that. And who doesn't want a democracy of 1.5 billion people on their side?
Thank you very much. This is probably the last question. From Japanese common narratives, U.S. Japan Security Alliance is the most important security alliance in the Pacific, from the viewpoint of Japanese, as I said. How do you see concrete steps to operationalize the U.S.-Japan relationship with other emerging multilateral arrangements such as AUKUS?
I'm not sure I'm catching the nuance of your question. Do I think there's multilateral opportunity? Well, I'm certainly a big fan of the Quad. The economic and diplomatic, components, which are the main underpinning of our approach to a free and open Indo-Pacific there between our 4, I think is incredibly important. There is opportunity, and there is a nascent organization. I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the term here, but diplomatically, we are cooperating on some developmental issues between the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and France. And I think Canada and some others have been there, like-minded partners. Mm-hmm. We call that. And we've had a couple of sessions in the region in that regard. I think those are important contributions, and we should do that going forward. But we've got a long way to go before we get to a multilateral security organization. And at this point, I think we get more bang for the buck, so to speak, to use U.S. colloquialism, to get the U.S. and Japan alliance deeper, for the 2 of us to share more deeply with Australia and India, trilaterally, quadrilaterally, and to recognize how important and how much capability that the U.S. and Japan would bring to the deterrent activities that are necessary, and God forbid if we ever had to fight, to bring to our alliance.
Thank you very much. Admiral Davidson, we promised that we get out before 10:15, and I would like to bring this discussion to the conclusion, but would you like to have a final word?
Yeah, once again, Satohiro, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA and many of the folks that follow our activities there. I'm quite pleased to be part of this organization. There's much more to know in the weeks and months to come as we watch the Russia-Ukraine conflict play out, and of course, the profound changes that we're seeing in the Asia Pacific with China's approaches, both in the day-to-day and its long-term objectives. It's going to keep us both in business. So thanks everyone for your participation as well today. And I appreciated the very important and very intelligent questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. With the opening of countries, societies, communities, and increased international travels, I see many Japanese policymakers coming to Washington this month, as well as during the Golden Week. And I saw Senator Haggerty, Senator Cardin, and Cornyn visited Japan. House delegation led by Speaker Pelosi has been postponed, but I understand that they are rescheduling the visit. So hopefully I will be or will be able to see you in person in Washington next time. And thank you very much for taking time, and we enjoyed the discussion very, very much. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.